Welcome to this session. So, excuse me, I'm Jude Sunderland, and I'm really delighted to have Ian Urbina with us today. There's this thing called sea blindness, and what that refers to is the fact that most of us don't think much about the oceans and seas of the world, except maybe when we're about to go on a holiday, despite the fact that they cover 2/3 of the globe. They're vital to our planet's survival. They feed us. Tens of millions of people work at sea, and they get us roughly 80% of everything we use. But sea blindness also refers to the fact that most of us know very little about the harms inflicted on people and the environment, far out of sight, often with total impunity. So Ian has spent the last decade opening people's eyes to the abuses happening near and far from shore. He founded and directs the Outlaw Ocean project, which is a nonprofit journalism organization that covers a vast range of human rights, environmental, and labor rights issues at sea. They produce compelling, detailed reports on a whole range of issues, usually reported directly from the world's oceans and seas. And the name comes from the award-winning series of articles that Ian wrote for the New York Times and his best-selling book. So we're really, really lucky to have him with us today. So thank you, Ian, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Some of us know Ian, many of us don't. So I'm going to kick off the conversation with Ian with some questions to take us through around 25 minutes, and then we'll open up for a Q&A with everybody. And at that point, I'll let you know how that can run. Yeah? Okay. So, Ian, again, thanks. Listen, you have referred to the oceans as a dystopian realm. So what do you mean by that? What are the range of abuses and actors out there?
So first, I really appreciate you inviting me, and I just have to say something about Human Rights Watch and my career and this line of reporting. It began in 2014 in the New York Times and then continues today in its own nonprofit. And it's a funny bookending that I've had in a relationship with Human Rights Watch. On the front end of the reporting, Phil Robertson in the South China Sea area in Thailand and specific was one of my original conscripted tutors and sort of pulling on the resources of Human Rights Watch in general to sort of help me find sources, operate safely in country, not make a fool of myself on the topic. And then more recently, the Libya reporting. Judith, you're too humble to admit, but you played that role on the other end of the bookshelf with a similar role, sort of guiding, tutoring, helping behind the scenes in the reporting. So to answer, so that's a long way of saying thank you to the work you guys do and to the specific role you've had with my journalism. To answer your question, dystopian realm, look, my outlook on the offshore realm is that historically it's been covered in a certain way, which is not wrong, but it's narrow. It's historically been covered as an environmental story. It's historically been covered as a place of awe and wonder and a marine life realm. And I kind of wanted to try to drive a reimagining of the space, make it a human story, also make it a place that, yes, it has quite a lot of beauty and wonder and marine diversity, but there are also just a lot of people out there working in different ways, some for good, some for bad. And while I can't say that crime is more prevalent out there, what I can say a decade in is that it more often occurs with impunity. And often it's quite severe and with impunity. And that makes it distinct from the onshore realm. So the diversity of abuses that happen out there and how often they happen with little awareness and little accountability makes it quite distinct and dystopian.
Thanks. Well, you've worked an awful lot on the issue of sea slavery, which is a term that actually I discovered through your reporting. So can you tell us what that refers to and what you've documented over the years?
Slavery is, as you folks better than anyone know, is a fraught term. It's a freighted term, and it brings a little bit of risk for its drama and its prior historical, connotations. At the same time, and really what I'm referring to in sea slavery, and most is um, the spectrum of trafficking, from what one might call more acute to one might call maybe chronic or less acute. On that spectrum of trafficked people, force, fraud, and coercion being the core ingredients of trafficking in traditional definition, you have people that, against their will, in different ways and to different extremes, are in a place working. Okay, so sea slavery, as I use it, is referring to people on that spectrum that have been most often trafficked and are in a situation of bondage, either debt bondage or straight out shackled and shanghaied or kidnapped. It spans the gamut, but it refers to these problems, this situation, as they play out offshore. Now, if you look at the offshore realm, it's important to think about it in a bifurcated way. Boats and people that are out there are typically, whether they're long-term or short-term players at sea for long periods, a day, a week, or for a year, 2 years, or short-term, a day, a week. That's usually near shore, distant water. That's a dichotomy. But if you think of it in a different divide, you have merchant marine, so ships carrying stuff, oil, Nike shoes, iPhones, what have you, containers, or fishing vessels. And if you really think about ships and numbers of humans, you're looking at 53 million that are in the fishing fleet, near shore or distant water, and 1.53, it's much smaller numbers in the merchant marine. Merchant marine ships that carry stuff tend to be more unionized. They have contracts. They're better financed typically. There are insurers involved, etc. So while I'm not here to say that crimes don't happen in that realm, there are serious crimes that happen in the merchant space and the cruise ship space. The kinds of crimes that involve sea slavery are more often in the fishing fleet, and quite especially in the distant water fishing fleet. Those are the vessels that stay offshore for much longer periods of time, for reasons you can probably intuit.
But why, can you tell us a bit more about the abuses that are taking place in the distant water fishing, and what bunkering is, for example, and how that plays a role?
Yeah, so the acute crimes that we cover range from murder on camera, whether it's murder of deckhands, murder of stowaways, murder of supposed pirates, murder of pirates, murder of people at sea, rape, not a hugely prevalent, but nonetheless a documented crime that occurs at sea, uh, all the way over to the less acute, the more chronic wage theft, debt bondage, abandonment. These are slower moving threats that are equally devastating. Often they can ruin people's lives, but they occur in slow motion. And they're often much more prevalent and harder to cover journalistically. But that's the spectrum of human and labor crimes that you often find. Violence is prevalent on a lot of this order of ship, where often when you have mixed language or ethnic or nationality crew, which is quite common on distant water fishing vessels, you have a higher prevalence of violence, and often on transshipment vessels. So fishing vessels that go out to sea and don't come back into port to offload their catch, but rather they stay at sea and they offload their catch on the water to another mothership, a refrigeration vessel. That's transshipment. And that's the norm these days with distant water fishing vessels, because it's much cheaper and they're very far from shore, and the cost of fuel and whatnot and the possibility that crew will jump ship and leave is much higher. So if you just stay at sea and you transship your content, it's much more price efficient. And though that subsection of vessels, the transshipment vessels that stay at sea for a long time, quite often on the high seas, quite often flagged or carrying cargo and crew of poorer nations, developing nations. Those are usually the variables that hone you into the higher risk factor for sea slavery. Bunkering, I think, bunkering is just the process of fueling in the shipping world. And so if you're unloading dirty fuel, or more often uploading clean fuel, you can do that in port, or you can do it at sea. And that's another, some of these fleets that stay at sea and transship their cargo also have fuel vessels that go out to them and bunker them. They load them up with fuel.
Right. And you've worked a lot on what's called illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, IUU fishing, and also on the intersection between IUU fishing and labor rights abuses. Can you tell us a bit more about that, and maybe walk us through one of your recent investigations?
Yeah, so IUU is this sort of nerdy acronym that is meant to encompass sort of shades of gray. It's important just to not just talk about illegal fishing, because a huge, in my view, probably the most important portion of problem out there when it comes to sustainable fishing, and simply put, the worry that the oceans are running out of fish, which indeed they are, has to do with the U and the U, unreported and unregulated. And oftentimes, unreported will refer to country X gives a license to fleet Y to come in and extract fish, but there's a huge amount taken out of the water in various means that goes unreported. And the actual rate of depletion, the unsustainable extraction of this resource is woefully undercounted, if counted at all, and that's unreported. And unregulated is there's just this whole realm, namely the international waters and high seas, that are sort of, they belong to no one and everyone. No government really has jurisdiction. No laws really have a police to impose them when it comes to the high seas. So what you take out of the high seas beyond, waters of national jurisdiction, either 12 or 200 miles from shore, when you're out there, which is the bulk of the blue on the map, is high seas, that's unregulated. So there aren't real functioning. There are a couple places and they have huge problems. There's a patch here and they just regulate tuna, and a patch there and they just regulate cod, but it's not comprehensive. It doesn't have teeth. These are treaties. It's by consensus. So they're deeply flawed. There's no police. There aren't really consequences if you break the rules. So they're really paper regulations that don't really do much. So that's IUU. How it intersects with sea slavery and these other crimes is, crimes of various sorts often go hand in glove, and they are cohabitants. A lot of the unsexiest, if that even is a word, crimes, but the ones that have the most implications, white collar crimes, so document fraud, tax evasion, these sorts of things that actually are criminal penalty in most rules, in most countries' laws. There are criminal penalties, not civil penalties, for those sorts of things because they've been existing for a long time. And a lot of real hardcore folks in this space, advocates and lawyers and journalists, know that if you really want to apply pressure and stop one type of crime, like illegal fishing, which is a civil crime in most places, then you really should connect it with the criminal, rules that were broken that are always associated. So document fraud, vessel identification fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, these things are prerequisite and connected to illegal fishing. And if you really want to make something stick and make a captain pay attention or a country's government pay attention, then you probably want to connect them, and they always go hand in glove. When it comes to human rights issues and its overlap to environmental issues writ large, and IUU specifically, the general story in this offshore realm, which is roughly true everywhere you go, is that near shore stocks, whether it's off the coast of poorer nations or wealthier nations, have largely been overfished. Usually in the poorer nations, it's by industrial foreign fleets. But whoever did it, basically the waters have been raked clean. And so ships now, and that's in the last 15, 20 years. So when the nearshore folks, fisher folk, artisanal, fisher folk, or industrial commercial players, whether domestic or foreign, want to get fish, they have to go way further out to sea. And the economics of that don't look great. The cost of fuel, the cost of manpower, etc., going further and further away drives, in this industry, your profit down. And so that's when you have an environmental story turning into a human rights story, because you get a incentive to cost cut. And one of the places you can most easily cost cut and cut corners so that you can stay in the black and maybe even make profit is by using traffic or wage theft or these other things that indirectly impact humans.
Thanks. And are there, I'm reluctant to ask you to do a ranking, but I'm just curious if there are, if you could mention if there are the worst players in the fishing industry, and why.
Yeah, so it's always tough. Well, let me answer the question. The worst players are the Chinese, and that's not because the Chinese are worse. It's because the Chinese are bigger. And even when you look at it proportionally, they're worse when it comes to both labor, human rights, and environmental issues. But the large reason that they're worse is that they're sort of late to the game. China is doing what the US and Europe did only a decade and a half, 2 decades ago with the Belt and Road Initiative and with lots of other things. They're trying to grow their empire, much like we did previously, and they're using much of the same tactics. And one of the ways they're growing their reach from the perspective of geopolitics, from the perspective of oil and gas rights, from the perspective of sort of commerce throughways, so ships can travel and carry those iPhones to us, without obstruction, from the perspective of food security for a burgeoning and massive population and middle class. From all these perspectives, one of the places you see China really growing is on the water and through its Navy, Coast Guard, and its fishing fleet. And that's been a well-documented, non-speculative, explicit mission of the Chinese government over the last decade and a half. And this is something we're working on now and have been a big series about them. But again, one wants to be careful, especially as an American, especially on the heels of the Trump administration that really played in xenophobia and racist sort of stuff. Like, this is not to be said that the Chinese are inherently worse. It's to be said that the Chinese fleet is bigger by an order of 5 to the next biggest distant water fishing fleet. We're looking at, where the US may have, 200 to 300 distant water fishing vessels. You're looking at the Chinese that has, by government estimates, around 2,000, by non-government estimates, upwards of 17,000. And that has to do with China doesn't consider the waters off Taiwan, Hong Kong, South China Sea as distant water. China considers those as nearshore domestic waters because of how they define what China is. And so those waters actually don't even make it into the 2,000 count of their distant water fishing fleet. If you actually look at what the rest of the world sees as foreign waters, not domestic waters, the number of actual vessels on the water that the Chinese have put out there with large government subsidies is on the order of 15 to 17,000. And that's massive. That means all the tuna, all the squid, for example, we're looking at squid. There's a huge monopoly of it being pulled from the waters onto these ships. And historically, pre-COVID, China depended on a lot of foreign labor, especially Indonesian, and that heightened the likelihood of, for reasons, again, you guys at Human Rights Watch can surely intuit, of abuses, bamboozling in contract, wage theft, violence, murder, etc. So you have a higher prevalence of these sorts of crimes on those ships because they're distant water, they're using foreign crews. COVID changed the game, and now China's using a lot of domestic crews because it was just hard to get people out of Indonesia and Philippines or West Africa. But they are still, to some degree, and there are still huge problems even with Chinese crew, because it's the standard story. A lot of the deckhands that work on Chinese ships are being courted from the rural areas. They're often, not savvy about contracts, maybe don't even read, etc. And so they're easy prey for really serious abuse.
Yeah. I want to ask you about another phenomenon out at sea, just shifting the conversation a little bit, to reflect on the fact that, every year, as you know, of course, thousands of migrants and refugees take to the seas, often in completely unseaworthy vessels, and an unconscionable number of them die. Others experience interdictions and pushbacks and return to places where they can face horrific abuses, like in Libya. But as you know better than I, the duty to rescue is deeply embedded, right, in the seafarer ethos, and there is a legal framework and a logistical framework for ensuring search and rescue at sea. So what is happening? Where are the gaps? Where do you see the main problems?
So we called the series and the book and the organization the Outlaw Ocean for a reason, not the illegal ocean, right? It's the notion that a huge amount of what happens out there is extra legal, which is sort of to say that it's not always bad. It's often gray area. And that's for a bunch of reasons, one of which is out of sight, out of mind, out of reach, out of enforcement. Nature of the beyond the horizon realm allows for things that maybe shouldn't be gray area to become gray area. Okay, so one of the big reasons that you have, again, by official black letter rule, one thing, but by actually how it gets played out in the real world, quite another, is the very thing that attracts me to the space, and that is, if you have a factory that's employing 12-year-olds making soccer balls in some forest in Guatemala that ships them to the U.S. Nike stores, right? And Human Rights Watch gets wind of it and starts sending some covert folks to check it out, and union organizers and others, like that's a plausible scenario that's been played out time and again, and that's when Human Rights Watch and the like trigger supply chain reckonings, because the big story that comes out of the work that you guys do by knocking on that door and exposing it causes a certain domino fall, right? But at sea, it's tougher to show up and knock on that door or send in someone discreetly, right? So the remote nature of these workplaces, if you think of a ship as a factory floor, just like in Guatemala, it's just on the water. The remote, inaccessible nature is one big reason that these laws are, pretty darn tough to enforce. And that pertains to migrants, or that pertains to working conditions. Another big thing is a lot of things that are written are not actually laws, they're treaties, and UNCLOS, UN law, the sea, perfect example, the US hasn't ratified it. They say that, and to a large degree they do, but they say, look, we comply with it, we just don't want to sign it for all sorts of other commercial, historical reasons. But a lot of players have taken that route, so they're not binding because they're not actually signatories to it. And then there's also it's this weird specialized place where if you, and should you would, your fluency is distinct, but most folks, even within the very well-read realms that you work at, wouldn't realize that, okay, so you have a scenario, say, on the Mediterranean, where you've got this obscure body, part of the UN, called the International Maritime Organization, that approved the redrawing of a map on the Mediterranean that de facto essentially gave the Libyans the right to claim from their shoreline out 90 miles, almost all the way to Italy, a search and rescue zone, which they then, by the UN giving them the seal of approval, empowered the Libyans in armed boats provided by the Italians to harass Doctors Without Borders and others who are trying to scoop up migrants who are at the actual high seas line. But the Libyans show up and say, back up, you're near our target and you're in our waters. They're not in their waters. They're in international waters, and the law is on the side of Doctors Without Borders. But when you've got guys with a gun pointing at you and they're referencing UN recognition of their search and rescue zone, there isn't a fluency even among the elite folks of Doctors Without Borders about who's in the right, and it kind of doesn't matter if they got a gun trained on you. So this is what I mean about, like, you can get away with things in this space that you couldn't get away with on land, A, because there isn't a broad fluency about what the rules are, and B, there isn't even the ability to pressure the relevant players, because the organizations that did allow for this fluency, and these rules, like the International Maritime Authority at the UN, are sort of a bunch of, with all due respect, a bunch of bureaucrats who don't engage in enforcement and are not really looking to get into fistfights over the legality of what just happened there. They're just trying to approve certain things on paper. And that's a little bit different at sea than you might find it on land. And that's one of the reasons why you can see things. You can see, the Libyans opening fire in international waters on a migrant vessel and claiming they're rescuing them and providing humanitarian aid when the migrants did not want to be rescued and taken back to a war zone and were begging to be rescued actually by the Doctors Without Borders folks who have authority. That's how that can happen.
Yeah. Thank you. But so, I mean, who is out there trying to monitor and document abuses besides the Outlaw Ocean project, besides you and your team? Who's out there and what are they doing?
Well, we're out there, again, just like in all humility, only riding on the coattails of others who own boats. So, as much as we are and we try to report all our stories out there, it's only through help with these organizations. There are a few, and none of them really specialize in human rights. There are, Greenpeace and Sea Shepherd. So in terms of the NGO space, the two big players on planet Earth that actually have vessels in real numbers, there's some smaller ones. We're about to go out with one, a spin-off outfit called Earth Race, ex-Sea Shepherd person who has one big ship and a big drone, and they do similar stuff. But when it comes to actually monitoring and policing marine issues, Greenpeace and Sea Shepherd are the big players. And just for those who don't know, Sea Shepherd is a sort of spin-off entity, it spun off of Greenpeace historically to be more direct action and to engage in more aggressive campaigns to push back on especially environmental crimes at sea. And then Greenpeace, everyone knows Greenpeace. Those are the two big players that have boats on the water and doing stuff constantly. Greenpeace is much stronger at research and policy. Sea Shepherd is really good at direct action and press, and both of them are important. Greenpeace puts out really good research, including some that drifts in the last 5 years, especially into the realm of human and labor concerns, but their core mission historically has been environment. Then you have players that have boats on the water doing targeted things, Doctors Without Borders and others, say in places on the Mediterranean, and they're doing heroic work that are human focused, but they're pretty narrow and they're intervention, they're not policy driven, etc. And then beyond that, and there are good NGOs like Human Rights at Sea that do good research, but they're not with boats on the water, they're not getting out on the water. And then it's a wasteland, frankly, journalistically and from an advocacy standpoint. 50 million people, over 50 million people work out there, and for there not to be dedicated players or arms of long-running organizations, Amnesty, Oxfam, Human Rights Watch, doing this kind of work aimed at the crimes and the people in that sprawling space is surprising. It's disheartening. It's one of the reasons I stepped away from the New York Times to sort of focus on this, is to try to help empower a movement toward more of that kind of direct, advocacy.
Great, thank you. I was going to do a follow-up question about what role could Human Rights Watch play, but I think you sort of already made a pitch for us to get more involved. I will just say, as you know, but just so that everybody on the call knows, the Human Rights Watch has done work on trafficking and forced labor in the Thai fishing fleet. We've done a lot of work on the rights of migrants and refugees and others at risk at sea of dying, of being pushed back, etc. And there is some ongoing work on the labor and environmental abuses associated with shipbreaking. But there's clearly a lot more that we could be doing, right? So I think we're sort of at the limit of this part of the session. I'm sure that a lot of people have questions, so I do want to allow for that. Thank you, Ian, for everything you just laid out for us. And let's see how we're going to do this in the following way. If you are not on screen but have a question, please put it in the chat and we'll read it out. If you're not on screen but you would like to be in order to pose your question directly, which was wonderful, please put your name in the chat and you will be admitted. And of course, if you're on screen and have a question, do the same. Put your name in the chat and we'll come to you in the order that you appear. And I am going to have some help but I'm going to have to go way up on the chat here. But let me first go to Bill Frlick while I look at all the questions in the chat. Bill, you should be able to jump in. So that everybody knows, Bill is the director of the Refugee and Migrants' Rights Division and was key to organizing this session. So over to you, Bill.
Great, thank you. And Ian, your book was really great, so I highly recommend it to everyone. Outlaw Oceans. I want to quote a couple of things from your book to you and have you comment. You talk about seafarers and long-haul fishermen as inhabiting, quote, a world where lore holds as much sway as law. And you describe a culture where ships are masculine and military-like arenas, where there's honor and hardship and the ability to endure without complaint, where life on board is rigidly hierarchical and decidedly undemocratic. And you say silence is the core to the way of life on ships, and breaking it can be a dangerous crime. In the face of that culture that you describe, which seems so diametrically opposed to the culture we inhabit at Human Rights Watch, I think, how would we go about sort of breaking through that culture to promote rule of law, transparency, and accountability? Which is pretty much what you guys are trying to do as well. But you're up against many of the structural problems that you mentioned in terms of jurisdiction, fluid lines of nationality, jurisdiction, and high seas. But there's a cultural element here too, which I think is really challenging. And I just wanted you to address that if you could. Thanks.
Yeah, well, thank you, Bill, for organizing this and for the kind words. So I don't have a great answer, so I'll give you a mediocre answer. My sense is that a bottom-up approach to attempting to shift culture within this realm, if you think of approaches as top-down, bottom-up, and across the side, so a bottom-up approach would be finding concrete ways to really implement tools that deckhands can use to better protect themselves. So someone earlier mentioned unions. You can imagine a scenario where you have individual wins, like where you take on cases and you advocate for, maybe with lawyers, maybe with unions, maybe with all journalists, all the above, and you start winning these illustrative cases and the cases, I'm not just thinking legal, I'm thinking like you are in the court of public opinion, court of policy, in the court of law, what have you. But I think when you start landing those sorts of things from the side or from the bottom up, you start showing the industry, the guys who run the industry and the guys on board, and this is a mostly male, so I'll use guys decidedly. So I think that's one way. So I don't. I also think there's some meta level things, and I saw Sif in here asking a question that might pull me into that realm. If you look at lots of different categories of crime, murder of stowaways, murder on camera, dumping of oil intentionally, arms trafficking, sea slavery, illegal whaling, illegal fishing, repo men who steal on behalf of banks, abortion providing, all sorts of different siloed issues that play out in this one realm, in this one frontier. And you think of the taxonomy in a broader way. It's not just plastic pollution, Somali piracy, and the BP spill. It's not just what Hollywood told us. It's way broader. Okay, then you think, what's the meta umbrella that overarches all those things, whether it's Vietnam or Ghana or Antarctica? One huge core thing that cuts across all of them is it's insane that this industry is allowed to operate so invisibly. Culturally and legally, historically, there's been this pass given that does not, especially post 9/11, allow the aeronautics or the freight or rail or trucking industry. You can't take X to Y on a plane and not indicate who's on board, what's the cargo, when are you arriving, and you can see me all the way. Like, you say that on a distant water fishing vessel belonging to the Vietnamese or the Chinese, they laugh at you. Like, there might be rules on the books that say they're not supposed to turn off their transponder, but there are all these exceptions, and even if they break them without the exceptions, no one's going to do anything to them. But you do that on a plane and you head into LAX, you got big problems, right? So, like, I think like there are big cross-cutting solutions that involve transparency, accountability, that then trickle down to all these other crimes because these players can't go invisible. That's not your question. You're asking the cultural question, but I do think they will affect the culture when there's pressure coming down. And the bottom-up transparency is onboard cameras, players such as yourselves or big unions, ITF, International Transportation Federation, the others that are finding ways to get more direct access to these workers who are targeted and abused, and find safe ways to do what you guys do in so many other places for decades, like surround them protectively, take their case, leverage their case that doesn't harm them, but that also pressures the industry. That could just be done for the same thing with all these deckhands that historically have been ignored. There were one thing I learned, I went to a talk that Samantha Power gave, and she bundled questions in threes. And that's how she got through much faster. So if you want to try that, that'll also discipline me not to go too long with Bill's question. Then I miss 10 others when we run out of time.
Yeah, I will take up that suggestion. I wanted to give people the opportunity to ask directly themselves, but I do think we'll run out of time because there are an awful lot of questions. So I'm going to combine at least two. Sophie from our Asia division is asking for suggestions about issues that the China team should be working on in this realm. So should we focus on forced labor? Should we focus on environment or food security, destruction, on violence? Where do you see our best contribution? I'm going to bundle that with a question about advocacy. What kind of advocacy should we be doing in this realm? Should we be focusing on the IMO, on the International Maritime Organization? Are there other key advocacy targets to address issues around labor rights or environmental degradation, broadly human rights issues? And Phil, who of course and you see on your screen, is asking about the EU's record on IUU issues.
Phil in all his floral grandeur. Yeah, so China, I'd love to have a separate meeting about that. We've been working for 11 months on China, and we have 7 more months. Went to the Falkland Islands and reported 2 weeks at sea, leaving in 2 weeks for the Galapagos high seas area, heading to North Korea or the edge of North Korean waters. We're really, really dedicating 2 years, and the entire staff is working on something big on China. And I'd love to talk with your team and just sort of lay out in full trust what we're doing, where we're seeing really promising things that no one's touched before. So let's do that separately. I think, one of the hard things in all, whether it's Human Rights Watch or anyone, is like, it's easy to tackle the journalistically sexy or advocacy sexy targets. It's harder to get folks to tackle the ones that don't feel as, headline grabbing. And one category of that is manning agencies. So these incorporated companies that engage essentially in human trafficking on a global scale, like that's a Human Rights Watch target. Like you guys with all the brain power and savvy, and then also just the insulation from needing to jump on the latest fad. Like those, if you really want to strike a blow at the beast, like going after the invisible corporate players who are making this system work, that allow for these captains to get away with murder, and the brands that buy the fish off them to get away with murder and pretend like they didn't know. Like it's all at the manning agency level. And so that's one thing from an advocacy point of view, and it's completely the type of thing that you guys could crush and no one else has the brain power to do. I think I don't have a lot of faith in like if you think of the social change theory and the stakeholder categories, you've got market players and government players in my little simplistic model, like on the high seas and on these issues, I don't have a huge amount of confidence that government players are super effective. You've got isolated success stories, Phil and HRW in Thailand, for example, like, and Jude in Libya, and you've got like some cases, but writ large globally, I personally think the Achilles heel that advocates might aim at, and definitely not the IMO, like, just sorry, with all due respect, like the UN and I just think that's not a good use of time. But the corporate players, and really hammering the folks who benefit, it's one step away from us who buy this stuff, right? But like up from us, the grocery chains and the big sellers, those are brand vulnerable, reputation worried beneficiaries of the hidden costs that are embedded in the supply chain. They benefit from the speed of the manning agencies. They benefit from the savings of using forced labor. They benefit in all these ways, and so do we. And hammering them in a really clear way is, I think, where you'll get change in the marketplace, because also the international nature of the high seas and the crews make it really hard to figure out which government am I going to aim at. That ship has a captain from one place and cargo offloaded in third place and crew from 2 different countries and flagged to a fourth that doesn't answer the phone, and like, forget that. Like, but go, where did the stuff come off of it, and what are the 3 big brands that would really be embarrassed if we say, hey guys, this is your supply chain and you need to know. That's where I think you guys could really leverage impact.
Let me just jump on that to key up another question, just one, sorry, but about the role of unions, because a couple of people were asking about that, both in terms of, what they're doing and what kind of partnerships Human Rights Watch could build with relevant unions.
Yeah, so I know the big player, ITF, much better than the small players, because that gets country specific and I'm moving around a lot. I know some of the small players in Thailand because I spend a lot of time there, but Phil surely does better and is more current. But generally speaking, I think small players are going to be, and also other stakeholders that are cousins to the unions are the Mission to Seafarers, Caritas, like the religious-based organizations are often the ones that are shoestring, frontline, in the trenches at the port, doing incredible stuff. Like, and teaming up with those folks who are they're the ones who are getting the deckhands and trying to relocate them quickly before the bounty hunters grab them. Like, those frontline players and some unions are key on the local level. On the meta level, ITF in the last several years has begun. They're historically, and most of their money comes from the merchant marine, that tiny section, all the contracts and all their successes. But they've started trying to branch into the fishers issue, and they've put some people in Thailand, some other places. I have lost touch a little bit about whether they're having any success. A lot of these folks, and you guys can say better than I, have lots of laws on the books that prevent the organizing of foreign labor, et cetera, that like make it even possible for unions to have any ability to do much. But that's again, country by country. But I do think categorically, unions, the religious sort of service providers, are big partners.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to throw 2 very big questions at you that you asked for. The first is about Somali Piracy from Sifton, who you know, obviously. So if you can say a few words about why Somali Piracy just completely collapsed a decade ago. So what led to that? Was it joint military operations, better safeguards, internal political issues in Somalia? Give us your thoughts. And another question from a colleague named Emily, who's asking just about how you would recommend devising a holistic approach to all of these different issues at sea, right? Given that there's so many aspects. So an approach that could integrate human rights law, refugee law, transnational organized crime laws, environmental protections. How would that look like?
The second one's going to be harder because I'm not fluent in law, and I'm not ducking it. Like, I don't think often through laws for the reason I just cited before about I don't have a huge amount of faith in this realm in particular. In other places like sweatshop work and stuff. But let me take Sifton's one. So 2008, 2009, Somali piracy peaked. It was a great business model. It was at this sort of magical, in a dark sense, moment where it was morphing from this sort of tax collecting, Robin Hood-esque, local play where, hey, if you guys are going to rob our waters, then we're going to tax you with our own localized tribal tax, folks. It had a moment where it was sort of that, and it quickly shifted into big business where it was an organized crime scheme, extortion scheme, and it was way more violent in subsequent years. And that moment really is 2008, 2009. Captain Phillips is in that time frame, Alabama, Maersk, Alabama. Why it fell apart? Two reasons, I think, personally. One is the maritime private security industry exploded, and a lot of big players began bringing crews of 3 and 4 armed South African, US, UK type, Indian, Sri Lankan, guards on board, and it just became tough for these guys to successfully board these ships because they had a lot of firepower coming at them. So that actually worked. Private maritime had huge problems, but it succeeded in that mission. And then secondly, the sort of international bring in some big Navy ships and flex some muscle. Those ships didn't really have actionable impact. They had symbolic messaging impact, because they couldn't get to places quickly enough to really do much, but that they were in the area really had an impact. And a lot of, there's still a lot of huge stuff happening over on the other side of Africa, Nigerian waters, for example, and off the coast of Bangladesh and these sorts of places. But yeah, the Somali piracy story, and this may be something that John knows better, but I've heard smart people that I trust riff on internal factors on land Somalia as well that also explain a bit why. I think, as I recall them, it's been a while, certain key players within Somalia began putting their own patrols out there as well, and that third variable helped. It complicated things too because they became their own state-run extortion regime. But those three main variables are why Somali piracy isn't something you see in the news as much. And ships took some wise steps. They started swinging wide, further from land, and just some basic things, water cannons, and just hardening the external of their ship, and all these things added up to make it less profitable. Oh, the other question, big, comprehensive. I don't really have an answer that's in the language of law. I think that the best I can think on these issues is, where do I see, if this is a beast, if the problem is a big beast that has lots of tentacles, then I think like the body of the beast is probably finding ways to really locate on the ground hotspots of abuse. South China Sea, Chinese, South Korean, Taiwanese, coast of West Africa. These are real hotspots of lots of different issues. And so geographically looking where a lot of the issues get played out, various issues, stowaways, arms, dumping, sea slavery, shenanigans with corporate structure, etc. And then also finding ways to apply pressure, quite especially to the local government and corporate players benefiting from it. So it's not a great answer, but that's probably how I would begin thinking about mustering resources.
Thanks, Ian. There are a few more questions that I could read out from the chat, but it's feeling very exclusive at this point. So I wanted to invite anybody who already has a microphone, if they have a follow-up for Ian or anything they wanted to say. Phil, Sifton, Phil.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on my question. Actually, in the realm of solutions, I just wanted to get your assessment about how the EU is doing on IUU. This is one of the few areas of leverage that we actually see on fishing fleet behavior, is when the EU comes in with a yellow card and threatens all seafood imports or exports to the EU.
Yeah.
So what's your assessment of that? And then second to that, I had a big argument with DJ Mare back in 2018 saying, look, you guys should extend your concern about environment to also include labor issues and human rights issues. And they thought they acted like I had, committed some sort of cardinal sin and to even suggest it. And we had a big 45-minute argument about it. I mean, do you see any sort of movement to sort of broaden it out beyond IUU to include some of the other issues related to the abuses that happen on fishing fleets?
Yeah, so let me move fast because I do want to. I've got time, but I know you guys want to get out in 9 minutes. Number one, I think the EU carding system is really effective. And again, I'm mouthing some stuff back to you, Phil, that you and I have discussed over the years, and I've heard from you. But I do find when you put like two key mechanisms that are similar, the trafficking persons report, the tip report in the US, and the ranking system, I do think that I've seen more instances where I hear murmurings from key government officials, including in Thailand, that they're way more worried about the yellow carding and the concrete implications that could have on imports and dollars, and so they care a lot more than that. The State Department, it's important, the tip report, ranking adjustments there, but it doesn't really have the teeth that the EU does. So I think that's really key. I'm eager to get to this other question. Back in 2015, I guess it was, like I went to the Outlaw Ocean conference, which is this big thing that the State Department puts on. It was in DC that year. And I like made this point that like illegal fishing as a term, as a legal category, has to include not just did you catch it with a net you're not supposed to in a place you're not supposed to go, but also did you catch it using a 13-year-old trafficked Cambodian kid? Like how can that not be part of the definition of illegality? Just because it's a human crime doesn't make it any less part of the product's, the illegality that packages that product. And crickets. I mean, it was not a popular speech at that event. And the waters parted as I left. No one came up to say, yeah, I want to talk more about that. And I think it's because epistemologically and professionalized wise, you got your NOAA people in the US government, you got your fish people, and you got your State Department people in the tip office, and people are like specialized in the way that they've been professionalized. And for good reason. They've specialized in the law, and the tools they have always been, and we're saying, hey, that's a problem and it needs to be corrected. It's an uphill fight, but I really think we should not budge on it, because you're going to have, just again, if you look at the history of movements and you compare, say, the labor movement or the human rights movement next to the environmental movement, in my humble opinion, you look at unions alongside green organizations, the funding, the manpower, the legislative accomplishments are night and day. And that's because one is left and one is liberal. Sorry if I'm being blunt here. And like a lot of the successes of the environmental movement give them a lot of leverage that do not exist in the anti-trafficking, anti-human rights issues in the unions. And what you will have is a lot of the solutions that will come out of the green movement will be very narrow. And in 5 years, when the New York Times, the AP, or whoever it is, puts another piece out there saying, yeah, you gave these guys approval as like clean, so you can buy your shrimp or your salmon or whatever, but come to find out all these human things are embedded in the same thing, and we're reinventing the wheel. And that just keeps happening over and over again until you force these folks to actually, NOAA and state or whoever it is, to start working together. And I think the EU actually does a little bit better job in having labor criteria a little bit integrated in their carding system, more so than anything NOAA does, for example.
Thanks, Ian. There are way too many questions for us to cover, but I am going to use my prerogative to ask a question that Susanna has put in the chat about the climate effects of overfishing. And I would just broaden it to include just thinking about the impact on coastal communities, fisher people, and indeed the intersection with migration, as you and I have discussed. Since, what actions do you think are needed in order to regulate overfishing? And there was another question about plastics and the prospects for a plastics treaty that I'll throw in there.
Okay. Yeah, I'll duck the plastics treaty one because I just haven't been paying attention for lots of reasons. So I don't know a whole lot about that. But I'll say something about it. So climate change, I think there are a couple, again, big picture, metaphorically, like kind of reimagining how we think of this space issue. One is it's really important to remember that like the carbon capture potential of healthy oceans is massive, right? Like it's really important if we're going to slow things down, the hurt that's going on. If we're going to slow it down, we cannot rake clean the oceans of their biological diversity, because a huge amount of that diversity isn't just nice and cute and we eat them, but they also capture and process things in a way that are really important, and also filter the 50% of the air we breathe. So thinking about the oceans being raked clean and becoming essentially a desert has real implications on a meta level about our ability to slow down the rising temperature and carbon capture emissions. Point one. Point two, on a food security level, the places that are most vulnerable, the artisanal fishers and poorer nations, climate change is super problematic, and industrial overfishing separately, in that climate change is redirecting routes in a way that's drastic. And sometimes it works to the benefit. That school is now migrating closer to shore, and the local guys, again, mostly male, are having a boom. But the bust is serious when that, whatever it is, squid stock suddenly is cutting left this year, not right, because the currents and the temperatures are shifting faster, and that just bottoms out entire villages. And the speed that that's happening and the severity is intensified by climate change, and that has like famine level consequences for communities that rely on it, and that's climate change. Then industrial fishing, where you're just raking all the nearshore stock, or like in Gambia, you're taking fish that used to be eaten and you're running it to a factory that grinds them up and makes them powder to feed shrimp in India, rather than allowing the Gambians to eat it as a staple, affordable staple. Like industrial overfishing on its own has major impacts for food security in the weakest of nations, in the poorest nations that are most vulnerable. So those are two things. Plastics, I mean, look, plastics I think is like a huge and worthy target. It's not one we go after because it feels crowded. And I just haven't found a good way to do something new that feels different. It's a massive issue, waste in general being allowed to be funneled into the oceans as if the oceans are a bottomless pit, and the non-biodegradable nature of plastics has mean all the statistics you guys have already read. Whether there's a treaty or not, again, I don't study it enough. I'm often crassly dismissive of treaties and such, but maybe there's merit in it. I just don't know enough to really have an informed opinion.
Thank you, Ian. I think we have time for one more question, and I'm going to give it to John Sifton. Can you unmute, John? If not, yeah.
Sorry, this platform is new. No, I just wanted to ask you quickly about the role of the U.S. Navy, Indo-PACOM, and just NATO navies in general. Well, I should say NATO/G7 navies in sort of crafting policies about anything and everything that you've been talking about. Do you feel like, talking to the Pentagon, to Indo-PACOM, to others is a worthwhile use of our time in discussing things outside of, their core competency, which is military matters? Or are they just not a, potential advocacy target in any meaningful way? I'm talking about issues outside of their own domain.
Yeah. So I initially had really high hopes of part of what we do aiming at navies, U.S. and others. I've started shifting more towards Coast Guards. And I think the reason I've found, even within the U.S. Navy, a lot more eagerness, willingness, fluency, and actual outcomes in Coast Guard is because it's a law enforcement agency in many ways, rather than a war-making agency. And so it's also Navy is more staid and slower to change, and Coast Guard is kind of always trying to stay alive and justify its budget and stuff more so than Navy, I think. So I've found the Navy is the Coast Guard is a much riper target in our work, and they're doing interesting things way outside of U.S. waters, ride-alongs and the like. I don't see them doing pressure campaigns in individual countries with other armed forces, but they are doing interesting things, and they are eager to get into the fish game. and sometimes listen, at least, if not act on the human game, right? Navy is just a wall I've found. The only place where I think U.S. Navy could really, and has in the past, had a really interesting role is when they bring in their satellites and their big gizmos, and their big data, and they're like intel, and they partner with the Indonesians or whoever else and say, like, we can't tell you how we know this, but we know that this ship that you really need to stop is, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's a place where, again, you, John, and folks who actually have relationships in these places could lean on Navy players to do more actions with individual cases and countries. It's probably going to be that kind of stuff more, and then actual boats, or we just don't. A lot of it's like geopolitical.
Well, the reason I asked is because a lot of times what the Navy does is they partner with Indonesia or Sri Lanka or others because they can't work with the military because it's abusive. They work with the Navy on maritime security. But what is maritime security? So I thought, maybe it could be human rights.
South China Sea is the one place where you start seeing, because the geopolitical and the fishing story are super overlapped. The civilian militia, 1,000 boats that the Chinese put there that are ostensibly fishing boats but aren't. And there's all sorts of stuff happening there. So there's a lot more like freedom of Navy involvement because we've crossed the threshold. I haven't seen a lot of that having impact on IUU or human rights stuff in other places. I've seen like, hey, we're friends and we should have a trade deal and that kind of stuff, greasing the wheel through navies that way. And let's push back the Belt and Road. A lot of that in Latin America. Like, hey, we'll do a ride along and we'll throw a couple boats in, so long as you don't allow the Chinese to build that port. That kind of quid pro quo.
We are at the top of the hour, but if we can abuse for 5 more minutes of your time, Ian, I know that Bill had a question he wanted to ask, and possibly Hugh, but it's only Ian if you have time, and if others can stay on the line a bit longer.
Yes, I have time.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think that your point about the Coast Guard is great. The one thing about the U.S. Navy in particular, and I draw this from your book, was its involvement in counterterrorism and keeping people outside of U.S. legal jurisdiction and accountability. And I'm wondering whether that's continuing, and how we would engage in that with the U.S. Navy. So it's kind of adding on to John's question.
Yeah, I'd say call my friends at Human Rights Watch to ask that question. If you guys are reporters, I'd be like, I don't know, but I bet you someone there does. I haven't kept tabs on like interrogation, offshoring interrogation, and how much that's still done. I used to pay a lot of attention to rendition and Gitmo and all that stuff, but I haven't looked at it in a long time, so I don't know.
It did happen. I mean, there was this period where, especially in Somalia, they were taking Al-Shabaab and taking them to ships off the coast and interrogating them for months at a time. But it doesn't sound like it lasted beyond the Obama administration.
Great.
We'll leave that one. That's just precious enough.
Leave that hanging. Okay, I have one final question, but Hugh, did you want to jump in with a question?
Sure. And my question, I find this extremely interesting. Thank you so much. My question is more about your background. I just checked your Wikipedia page. I see you left New York Times almost exactly 3 years ago. Any regrets for sort of moving over to the NGO scene?
No, I mean, look, I love the New York Times, and I have nothing but positive things to say. It was the teaching hospital that took me off a corner and trained me to do this craft. I only left because I wanted to try new things, and I also wanted to stay on this topic, and typically investigative folks are pushed onto a new topic every 2 years. Their challenges, I have a staff of 10, and we have a very different model. So we fund all our own stories because, Libya cost over $200,000 to produce, and, the best paying magazine in the world will pay $250 a word at 10,000 words. You do the math. There's a huge gap there. So you're never going to really cover your costs with those kind of stories. So you got to find some alternate model. We we do that by subscriptions, you know, $5 from mom and pops and big philanthropies. That takes a lot of hustle, and I'm burnt out on it. I'd like to just focus on reporting. So that's one challenge or regret, you know, just running an organization, personnel, fundraising. I'd prefer just to be working on the reporting. But the returns have been well worth it, you know, having freedom to chase these stories in a different way, breaking certain core things in the profession of journalism that I think are not in the public good, such as exclusivity and copyright, that lock, you know, single stories down in one venue. We don't play ball with that, even with the New Yorker and places that have a lot of leverage. We say, look, you know, we'll give it to you for free, but you only get it exclusive for 2 weeks, and then we're taking it out and translating it into 10 languages and running it in Gambia and Libya and the places that actually need to read it, as well as Paris and Brazil. And that took a lot of work to get, you know, editors to agree to. But it's an unusual type of reporting that they're probably not going to find other places. And so far it's worked. But and so I really like that. That means we get way bigger readership than I ever got at the New York Times, because we're doing that sort of radical play. So yeah, I'm quite happy at the move.
Thank you.
Ian, thank you so much. I just want to give you a chance to tell us what we can do individually to sort of be more respectful of our oceans, and to support kind of sustainable fishing, and of course address the whole range of abuses that you've discussed today.
Start an ocean division. I know it's not your decision, but I think honestly, like, that's not individually, but there is a real void there, and you want to have impact. That is a virgin snow territory that you guys could go into. Just as taxpayer, you know, like, if you think of yourself as a buyer, a voter, an interlocutor with your kids or spouse or whatever, or family, a donor, you know, like, everyone has all those roles and others, like, and in small ways you can exert agency in each one of those roles, you know, in small ways. You know, I never say eat shrimp, don't eat salmon, you know, I don't ever go that far, and that's not what you're asking. But, you know, there are places, if you want to, like, think specifically of the silo of, I like seafood, but what can I buy? You know, Monterey Bay Aquarium, and some folks have rating systems that are decent, not perfect. So you can Google and find those. But yeah, I just think, you know, think widely about your different roles and see if there's small ways in which you can try to help in your chosen passion, you know, in that realm. And then more generally, you know, bigger impact comes from big plays, like organizations like yours getting in the game, because we could use help. We are outgunned. So, and I depend on the likes of you folks, you know, so staying in communication with me and my staff and trusting us never to burn you, those relationships allow us to do this special kind of journalism, because we have track record with people that know we're not going to run wild with what they tell us.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you so much for this discussion. You can see a lot of people are thanking you in the chat, because it has been really, really fascinating. And I just want to remind everybody, maybe somebody else can put the link in the chat, but the Outlaw Ocean Project website is wonderful. It's theoutlawocean.com, and it's got just so many